Hi everyone, good morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night, depending on where you are. Hopefully the sound's all good, like it was last time. So let's begin. First off, normal reminders. So number one, the edits in this video are going to be on Capture One 20.0.4, which is the latest version. Make sure you've got the latest version if you're already running Capture One. If you're not running Capture One already, then there are three ways to get hold of version 20. The first way is to download a free trial. That works for 30 days, unlimited, unrestricted, doesn't do anything silly like put watermarks on anything or anything like that. The second way is this month, so ending the 30th of April, there is 25% off all Pro version licenses. So for that, you use that code that's on the screen right now, which is Pro25. And the third way is there is a competition that is still running. You can win a Pro license, which is about 200 and something pounds, £299, something like that. All you need to do is go to that page on our website, so paulreefer.com/edit with us. That competition closes on the 15th of April. And it's a very, very, very simple competition. Concerningly, a few people from what we've seen have got the answer wrong. But it's literally a case of click on the right link, read the 30-day challenge, actually, which is the most important part. So Capture One themselves have created a 30-day challenge where each day there's a sort of 10-15 minute little tidbit that'll get you better at editing or at workflow. We've contributed one into that. All you've got to do is tell us what day that contribution is. So all you need to do is go to that page and you can be in with a chance of winning your license for free. For people that already have Capture One, there is also, remember, that upgrade offer for this month, which gets you 30% off, which is quite a big chunk, up to version 20, which is the current version of Capture One. Okay, let's go into Capture One. So good afternoon, ST. Good morning, David. Fellow hermit. Yep. We're on what day? Something day 18, day 19 of the Big Brother house or whatever it is. So let's get into some editing. Mark, you cannot hear me. It's a bit weird. Because everything else was okay. So hopefully a little restart on your computer will work. So let's go into our first image, which is this one. Golden Gate Bridge from the northern part, so on the Sausalito side of San Francisco. It is, looking at it, a morning shot, actually, with that light. And we've got a couple of tweaks we can make. So some of these tweaks are going to be familiar to you. Today we're going to talk about, in detail, some stuff around, obviously, shadow and so on, recovery. We're also going to go in another image in a bit into reverse clarity. So far, in all the edits we've been doing a lot of stuff where we're using clarity to punch detail. Well, today there's an image that we're going to use clarity to do the reverse and lose some detail just to smooth it out. That's not this image though, so let's get started editing this one. I'm going to close this browser, so Command and B, which gets rid of the library on the right hand side, and we can just focus on this image. Let's go into, hi Dean, hi Stuart, hi everyone else that's just joined. So let's go into this first pane. We always start with this pane, we talked about it before, which is the lens correction pane. So before we start making any changes and trying to fix colors and trying to fix things that maybe aren't quite so sharp at the edges, let's get the lens profile loaded in. So first thing is, has it picked up our lens that was used in this shot? Yes, it has. So that means that Capture One is picking up and using its profile for this particular lens. Now, reminder, it's still using a profile which is for the manufacturer's lens that the guys in Capture One measured. So if you really want to fix any chromatic aberration that may exist in this picture, you use these little three dots, and instead of using the default profile, we click Analyze, and that now creates an analyzed version of this picture with all the chromatic aberration fixed. So instead of the default manufacturer profile, it's now using the one that it's read in, using the detail that's in this shot. This was shot at f16, so I'm going to turn on Diffraction Correction, just in case. I don't think there's going to be much purple fringing. The reason is because there's not really many high contrast points. It's all pretty dark in here. Sometimes you get it in the cables. I mean, I'm at 400% here, so you're not going to you're not going to see too much detail in there. But in this sort of image, I don't see any high contrast points, so this purple defringing, I can turn it on if I want, but it's not going to have much of an impact. Okay, color tab. Well, we're going to come back to the white balance in a minute and make a couple of adjustments. But first off, what I am going to do is pull up some of the detail in here. So we can look at our histogram here. And if you remember for the last, I guess, probably 3 or 4 sessions, we've talked through the difference between pulling up exposure, which brings the whole histogram up, and we've talked about using high dynamic range recovery, which pulls up only either the top 30%, top 10%, bottom 10%, bottom 30% of the image. We also, though, a couple of sessions ago touched on levels, and there's levels that we're going to use here. The reason is because I don't want to shift this whole histogram up. If I shift the whole histogram, so I've got all this space here on the right hand side of the histogram, which means that I've got all this latitude here to pull our highlights to be brighter. If I were to print this image, and here's a good example actually, let's put our proofing margin on. So by that, I mean in my preferences, I'm going to increase this border just so I can see what it's going to look like in print. Now this image looks quite bright right now, and most of you, and actually I make the mistake sometimes of turning my monitor up to the highest brightness. The image looks great on screen. If I right click on here and go to white, this is now simulating white paper. Now imagine how dark this now looks to our eyes compared to when we had it like this, which was less distracting. So for editing, dark backgrounds are very useful, but they give us a false sense of security in terms of how bright the image is. Whereas if I were to, for example, pull up our exposure, okay, now we're starting to see something that would look great when printed. The problem is that I've pulled the whole histogram up, and we can see that by pulling exposure up, I've shifted everything up. So I've made the shadows less dark, I've made the midtones brighter, I've made the highlights, well, there weren't really any highlights, they're all midtones. I've made it all brighter. So instead of doing that, what I could do is just pull up the shadows. Okay. But now we get a flatter image again. So it's the same problem. We end up with a flatter image because what we're doing is we're flattening this histogram here. We're squishing everything up into the midtones because we're pulling up the shadows without doing anything up here to the midtones into the highlights. So instead of either of those tools, we've got another 2 choices. One is brightness. So brightness, if you remember from last week, we were, in fact, Monday I think it was, rather than pulling the whole histogram up by the same amount, what brightness does is it tends to sort of stretch the histogram out. So it leaves a lot of the shadows where they were, and it pulls the highlights up and the midtones up to the brighter area of the image. Again, it's brighter, that's good, so it's a better image when we print, but it's flattened. We've lost contrast again, same problem. So this is where the levels tool really comes into its own. So the levels tool allows me to remember we've got our input along the top, along the bottom, and our output along the top. So our output is saying when I print this, anything that's on this line is going to come out 0, so the blackest of blacks with no color or light information at all. This is going to come out mid-tone, this is going to come out white, bright white, 255 on our scale. And this here is our actual image. So by pulling this one in here, I'm mapping to say the things that were in the mid-tones, actually print them bright white. The things that were in the lower midtones, almost into the shadows, print them as if they were in the middle of the image, and the shadows leave them where they are. And the effect that's had on that histogram is all of a sudden I've got a really, really nice curve. So I've got a nice distribution of shadows, and I've got some midtones in here, and I've got some highlights. And I can see on the image, yes, it's improved in terms of brightness. If I switch back to our white image, a lot nicer to print, a lot nicer to look at. However, what I haven't done is flattened any of the detail. So this is one where levels really helps. Now, what we can do with levels is we can use this little auto button, and it will, okay. I was expecting it, it's funny, I was expecting it to do that. The reason it hasn't, so what the auto button is doing is it's looking at the histogram and it's finding the first piece of data that's nice and bright. There is a problem in this image when we use auto levels, which is it's got these pinwheels here, which are obviously the lens flares or the light stars, whatever you want to call them, sun flares and so on, of the street lights that were there. So when auto levels goes to do its stuff, it says, okay, well, let's move our histogram down to the first point of data that we've got in the image. Oh, it's there, it's right there, it's these lights. When we know if we do it manually, we can really override that because these bits that are overexposed, they're still overexposed. We're not going to change that. We're also not going to make it worse. So I can pull this a lot further to the left than the auto tool is going to do, and we've now got a nice balanced image. So with that balance, we can then do a couple of tweaks. So the first tweak is, let's pull up some detail in here. I don't want to use shadows. So our high dynamic range correction, if I use shadows, remember it's going to pull up the bottom third of this image. A lot of this image is in the shadows. So if I pull up our shadows, we're affecting the whole thing. That's not really any good. So instead, let's use this blacks area, which is the bottom 10%. And look, it's only affecting this rock here. So turn that off and pull it up again just a bit. We're using tiny amounts of correction in here. So we put it up by about 10 on that scale. All of a sudden, we've got some detail back in this rock. We've got an image that's a bit more punchy, a lot more brightness up here, especially up into the sky. Got some dust spots to fix in there. Let's just take that one out. So dust spot tool at the top. Don't be tempted to make this tool too big. So make it about the same size as the dust spot, just a bit bigger, and you'll find it's a lot more accurate. Okay, so that looks pretty good. The only thing now that's kind of left for me to play with is potentially some highlight recovery. Remember when we pulled those levels up, these did get a little bit brighter. Oh, let me just turn off our proofing margin. That'll help see the whole image at the same time. So these got a little bit brighter. By the way, that proofing margin, if you want to set a border, go to Preferences. Under your proof margin here, you can set this to be whatever you want. And then in Capture One, you can choose to display it or not, which is this button here. So that's with it on, that's with it off. Okay. For demoing on screen, it's just easier to have the full screen available to us rather than a border around the outside. Okay, so in these pinwheels here, we know that we pulled these levels up here, which has made these a bit brighter. So let's try and pull these highlights down just a touch, just to recover them a little bit, just to bring them back to where they were to start with. Then we can look at the white balance. So on here, so we know that it was sort of blue hour in the morning and so on, but what's a little bit unnerving is this here, and I know this concrete here should be grey really, this is a rock here, so that should really be grey. Now obviously in blue hour it is a blue tone, but it just feels a bit too blue in the areas that wouldn't be. The camera's white balance is obviously, if you think about what you've asked the camera to do, you've asked the camera to decide what's the correct white balance when you've got stuff that's bright yellow and bright blue in the frame. So we're going to override that, we're going to do it manually. We're going to pull this one up about there, looks about right, a bit more natural. And our tint, it's not too bad actually, we'll just leave that probably about there. So what that's done, and actually let me, I'm just going to do a little trick here. So I'm going to create a filled layer just to make it easier for you to see the difference. Let's pull this up wherever I was before. About there. Okay, and then this maybe about there. Okay. So that's a filled layer here, so I can show the mask. The mask means that everything is going to be applied to everything on the image. And in this layer, I've changed the white balance, which means now I can turn it off and turn it on again, just to show you the difference. And the big difference here is in these rocks here. At the moment, they are just too blue. They're just too cold. They don't make sense. Whereas if I put that white balance correction on, this now looks like the right color for a rock. And this up here has got this right color as it falls down because you've got yellow light falling on it. So it didn't make sense that with yellow light falling on it, it's still really cold here. So this little white balance correction is not too much of a shift on that scale, but that makes a big difference. Okay, final thing before we move on to another image is going to be a change to the keystoning. Now, Golden Gate Bridge is a bit of a problem. I've had this problem before, which is there's an optical illusion with it that appears on the camera, which is it looks like the furthest tower is leaning. If I pull up a guide, let's just add a vertical guide and draw. So on this tower here, what you've got to be careful of is the towers actually get smaller as they go up. So you can't draw a line from the edge here and see that that's moved in because it has actually got smaller as it's gone up. So that's no good for our vertical line. What is good for our vertical line though are these cable stays, because they should be level, right? They should be vertical, and they're not quite there. And then the same on this one. You see this lean over here. Let's add another vertical guide here. And with this vertical guide, we're going to just pull it across here to see how much of a lean we've got. Now, because the cables are going to be really quite obscured out in this distance, instead I can use this as the center of the tower. So I know that this little crisscross here should be the middle, and that crisscross should also be in the middle. So we know we've got a bit of a lean going on this. We've also got a little bit of correction to do on the horizon. So first thing, let's use our Keystone vertical tool. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to use our straighten tool first. So that's this one with the little circle around the cross. And I'm going to draw along the horizon. It's difficult to draw along the horizon when you can't see the whole horizon, but what we can do is use this part of the horizon here on the left, as far as we can see, and then draw a virtual line out here and just try and make sure that we've got it roughly correct, which is what we think. Okay, that looks a bit more like it. Now that straightening, what it's also done, as you can see, is it's almost lined up this cable correctly. It's pretty good. Hasn't quite done this in the background though. So let's now go into our vertical keystone. So on our vertical keystone, because we know that this bit's actually okay, I'm going to leave this vertical as far as Capture 1's loaded in. So whenever you load in the Keystone tool, if you load in the vertical one, Capture 1 will place two vertical lines that are completely vertical. So we don't have to do much work with them. If I wanted to, I could of course come across to here and to here, but I'm just creating work that I don't really need to do. But let's just draw that line there for that cable stay. And we need to draw a virtual line right down the middle. Cool. So that one on that side of the image looks good. Let's do the next one. So on the next one, we know that we're going to use this tower as our line. So we're going to go into the middle of the top here, and we're going to use this virtual line that it creates all the way down the middle of this tower here, there, and hit apply. So what it hasn't done is rotated the image, and that's exactly what we wanted it to do. We didn't want any rotation of the image because we've already straightened the horizon. What it's done, you can see here, this sort of crop around here. It's created a weird trapezoid shape that's mapped this image to be correct. So it's mapped the vertical here to be vertical and the vertical here to be vertical, which meant that it had to pull out the top a little bit. And that would actually make sense because it was taken looking up towards the bridge, so you get that parallax effect. So if I now hit our hand button, let's take away those guides, so turn off the guides. We now have a bridge that's straight, that is white balanced correctly, without any weird horizon or anything like that. We've got a tiny dust spot down there, which I've just seen. So let's make our tool a bit bigger using the square bracket and just tap there. Good, that's gone. So let's pull up our browser. I'm going to create a clone of that. So there's our original, and there's our finished one. Now, if I wanted more of the blue, so even though we're brighter, we've got a bit of a challenge in terms of how much blue we've got in this shot. If I want more of that blue, very easy to do. I wouldn't want to bring any more blue into here. So instead, what we'll do is we'll create a new layer. So this layer was called white balance. This layer is going to be called sky. So I don't want to affect down here, and I don't really want to affect anything in the water. So let's draw a gradient, a really, really soft gradient, all the way up here. Now with all of the tools in Capture 1, pretty much, there's a couple like Vignette that obviously wouldn't make sense to, but most of the tools in Capture 1, so for instance this one with this mask, you can use all tools with a mask. So whereas I would normally just go into the color editor and say, okay, well let's play with blue and just put more blue in, I don't want to affect down here. So this is very neat. You can use the color editor on a gradient layer. So we've got our blue up here in the sky. I'm going to use this picker tool. Click in here. We can see on the left hand side it's selected the right color, the blue. And I've got my left and right on my mouse to change the hue, so we can go more purple or more green. Well, we don't want to do either of those. We want to leave the color as it is. All we want to do is increase our saturation, which is up and down on the mouse. So as I move the mouse up, we increase some saturation. As I move it down, we decrease the saturation. And you can see it's only applying it on that gradient that we drew. So it's not touching the bottom of the image because there's no mask on the bottom of the image. So this is a tool that is only changing only the blue on only the area that is masked. So let's just put our saturation up by not much, about 10 on that scale. Holding down the Option key, I can then go left and that makes it darker or lighter to the right. So let's make it a touch darker a little bit more saturated, and then let go. So with that layer, I can, let's just make sure we're out to fit. So there's without, and there is with, and it's only affected the top part because only the top part had the gradient layer on. So if that makes sense, we can move on. If anyone's got any questions on that image, other than why didn't I see that dust spot there? Because that's now fixed. Cool, but that's our final version of that one, whereas that's the original. So we go from original, a little bit underexposed. When you print it, it's going to come out really dark, and we're losing a lot of the detail on the right-hand side. The final one, we've got a bridge that's now straightened, and it's correctly exposed for print. So when we go to print it, you're going to get the right amount of brightness out of it. Okay, next one, let's go on to a Rene picture. I'm going to close the browser again. So to close the browser, you either go to View and take the tick out of browser, or Command B. That just gives us more room to work without any distractions of the files on the right-hand side. Just one second, just have a drink. Cool. So on this shot, we have a lot of foreground. And foreground that's probably interesting when you see it moving, not quite so interesting visually on the final photograph. We've got a nice bit of sky with, you can see in here, there is some color in here, but we haven't actually picked up a lot of that color. So it's a long exposure. So let's try and focus on the color that we do have and making these mountains really stand out. So first thing is, this is a generic profile, it's loaded in. So the camera was a EOS R with an RF 15 to 35, so it may not yet be profiled by the guys at Capture One. What have we got? We've got the RF. Nope, so there's not a profile for it yet, which means we're using the generic profile. Generic profile's fine for most situations. When you get a real manufacturer profile, it's a little bit better. But for now, that's fine. I'm going to put on the Chromatic Aberration, and automatically, if you saw that little box there, it said analyzing. So on these ones, on the ones with the manufacturer profile, you have to tell Capture One that you want it to analyze over again. With a generic profile, Capture One's clever enough to know that it doesn't know the answer for this one right now, so automatically analyze and store that Chromatic Aberration map in this file as the aberration issues for this image with this sensor and this exact lens, not just a standard one that's in the lab. Taken at f7.1, so I'm not too worried about any diffraction. Am I worried about purple fringing? Not really. It's quite a flat image, so there's not really any high contrast points, and even out of the edges we're okay. Okay, so on lenses, I'm pretty happy. I just want to make sure we're straight, so let's use our little straighten tool, cross draw it along that long horizon. Okay, so is it, I don't know, 0.12 degrees out, something like that. Yeah, 0.2 degrees out. Not too worried about it, but we may as well get it exactly right. Okay. So first thing is, let's concentrate on the subject that's interesting, and let's cut some of the stuff that's down the bottom. So crop tool, if I hold down the shift key in my crop tool, I can override it into any format that I want, or I can choose and say I want this to be a 1:2 ratio, which means for every 2 wide, it's going to go 1 high. So now when I pull that corner in, it's going to force me into this aspect ratio. So let's pull this corner all the way up. So I want the full width of the image. And I'm trying to decide whether we want the mountain, so whether we want that on the 1/3 line. Probably not. I probably want about there on the 1/3 line. So I've got my mountains on about 1/3 up, and I've got this at about 1/3 up. So this is 1/3 down, sorry, this is 1/3 up. That's quite a nice even split for the image. That looks quite nice. Okay, let's have a look at our white balance. So in our white balance here, under our color tab. So this is our shot, that's what the camera believes it saw. Over long exposure, there's another little bit of a tip here. Your white balance is, I'm not going to say more or more likely, but it is possible that your white balance is off on a long exposure when you get to long periods of time. This is over 30 seconds, it probably didn't have much of an effect, but I've seen people shoot at, particularly at blue hour or at sunset or at sunrise, and with the camera set on auto white balance, and they'll do a, let's say a 4-minute, 5-minute exposure. even over that relatively short period of time, it's long enough where the temperature of the colour and the temperature of the light in the air has changed. So your auto white balance is obviously only measured at the point that you click the button, not throughout the whole scene. So a typical example of that is when the sun comes out halfway through an image. Yes, it can affect the exposure, but it's also changing the temperature of light that your camera's recording. So be careful with white balance when you're on a long exposure. It's more likely that you're going to end up doing some manual corrections later on. So on this one, I'm going to warm it up a little bit. I know it's meant to be cold, but let's just warm it up. Let's pull it to about, I don't know, about there. That's cool. We've got some colour coming back in the sky already by doing that. And let's pull our tint back away. So this way towards green, that way towards pink. We don't want either of those extremes because they're horrible. So let's go pretty neutral. Let's get it to about there. Okay, this is now giving me a bit more of a warm feeling to the image, but it's still got the ice in there. It still looks pretty cold. It's up north somewhere. So now I want to completely change the way that people look at this picture. So at the moment, obviously the brightest part of the image, so remember what we've said a few times ago, the eye is typically drawn to contrast first, and that's why we're looking for bright areas of an image. So the brightest part of this image is up here. The interesting part of the image is here, and then we've got another bright part of the image down here. So let's try and flip that around. So let's create a new layer called Sky, and we're going to create a nice little gradient down here. There. So remember, in our gradient, the first line where I started clicking is 100% applied, anything beyond that is 100. The middle point is 50%, and the bottom point is 0%. And the longer this gradient is, or the deeper that distance is, the softer the gradient will be, and the more of the image you're affecting. So on this one, I want to go to about there, no more than that. Actually, I don't want to touch the mountains even. And we're going to create another layer called foreground. Oops, spelled correctly, that would help. Okay, so with our foreground, exactly the same thing. So we're going to have a gradient, and on the sky, I was a little bit off in terms of our angle, and there's a reason, because I've got more sky over here than I do here, because this mountain changes. On the foreground, I want it pretty level. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key when I draw that gradient, and that stops me from moving. So let go of the Shift key, and this happens. Press the Shift key, doesn't do anything, it just goes up and down. Or if I go to 45 degrees, it'll do that, but it won't let me move in 1 degree increments or even less. It's fixed, so it's fixed onto 90, 45, 0, another 45, another 90 degrees, and so on. So this means that we know that that gradient is going to be straight all the way up. Cool. So with this gradient here, very simple, I'm going to go to my exposure tab, which is this histogram line up here. And let's pull our exposure down. Quite a bit actually. I'm going to go to there. Okay. And with our sky, I'm going to pull our exposure down as well. And again, all that's doing is just softening this bright area up here. It's bringing it down. It's bringing more of the interest to the middle of the shot. With our background, now that we've done that, look at what's happened with our histogram overall. It's all been crushed a little bit to the middle. So with our background layer, what we can afford to do now is pull our levels in a little bit, and actually we could pull our exposure up. So let's just see the difference. Let's go onto our browser. Let's create a new variant. And I'm not going to reset everything. I'm just going to take out that exposure change and the levels change. So we can see this is the image as is with the white balance correction that we've already done. And this is the change that I've made. So you can see what we've done. This area here is the darkest part of this picture. Whereas in this image, this area is the part of the picture with the most interest. And these areas have been darkened down. So we're losing focus on those. That's what that change has done. So it's two gradient filters, one for the bottom, one for the top. Both of them have had their exposure tweaked, but then it means that the background can have its levels tweaked to pull the whole image up. And the same principle applies to what we just showed you before, which is when I go to print this, so let's put our proofing layer on and go to white, This is now a lot brighter, a lot more interesting. It's got more contrast, more clarity and everything just by doing that, just by pulling those levels up and then darkening the top and the bottom. But we're not quite done. So let's turn off our proofing layer. Turn this back to very dark. David's just asked why exposure rather than brightness. So remember that in brightness, we have, and in part it's designed to do this, it's designed to have a flattening effect. So let me just see. I'm going to create a new filled layer just to show you. So this filled layer is experiment. And let's create another filled layer called experiment 2, just for fun. Okay. So by filled layer, what that means is I've got a mask, which is, oh, did I not create a filled layer? I didn't. That was silly. This one is, yep. And let's create a new filled layer called experiment brightness. Okay, so in our experiment for exposure on this filled layer, so everything is being applied to everything, let's pull up our exposure by, let's say, 1 stop. Okay, now look at what that's done to the histogram when I do that. So here it is in the middle, and then as I pull it up, the whole thing shifts to the right. Now in this case that's too much, but we'll come back to that. Now with brightness, let's pull our brightness up by, let's say, about 25, 30. Okay. Now that's had a similar effect. It's made everything a bit too bright. It hasn't pushed things off the edge. So in the experiment, we've got stuff that's overexposed now. Let me just call this one, let's make it more sense. Experiment exposure. Okay. So with exposure, if I turn our exposure warnings on, it's pushed some stuff off the edge of the histogram. Okay. Whereas on brightness, it's pushed less off the edge of the histogram. There's still some stuff that's hitting that wall, but it's certainly less than if we'd done it with exposure. But the difference is what brightness has done, let me turn this off, is it's flattened the histogram. So it's pushed things up to be brighter, but it's left lots of stuff back in the shadows. Whereas with exposure, it's pulled everything up, including the shadows. So what you tend to get the effect of with an exposure change is you keep the same amount of contrast, the same amount of difference between darks and light areas, but you risk pushing it off the edge. With brightness, I've got no risk of pushing it off the edge, but the whole image has become flatter. So if I look at these two in comparison, so that's with brightness, it's a bit flat. All the dark areas have gone a bit grey. It's all a bit mushy in the middle. With exposure, it's horrible because we pushed it too far, but you can see there's still a lot of contrast left in it. So if I've got an image that I want to brighten and I'm not worried about losing contrast, in fact, sometimes I want to lose contrast, then I'd use the brightness slider. If I want to keep contrast and I'm not worried about pushing stuff off the edge, either to the highlights or to the shadows, then I'd use the exposure. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. On our background, actually just looking at that, we have got a little bit of room to push our exposure even more. So, before, oh no, I was really at the limit. Let's go to 0.18. That's good enough. Okay. So that's about as bright as we can go without having to put in more gradient in the sky. Now in the sky, on this particular picture, it's really nice, it's nice and calm. However, by pulling in that gradient filter, we've also now seen there's a huge amount of detail in this sky. Some of it is really nice, it's the long exposure of the cloud. Some of it not so nice. So up here, you see all these sort of mottled effect bits up here. We've got a tool that can fix this. So we know that we've got our sky mapped with our gradient, and actually we know that all of this stuff here is quite nice. The mottled effect is up here on the top. So our gradient, as we know, it affects the top more than it affects the bottom. And this is where we were going to go through what I was talking about earlier. So to date, we've used clarity to make things clearer. Clues in the name. So let's put our clarity up on the sky. And that effect has got stronger up there because it's affected the midtone. So let's put it back to 0. And as we bring it up, we've got more and more and more of this mottled effect in the sky. Doesn't really fit the feel of this shot. So the feel should be nice and soft and serene. So instead of doing that, let's pull our clarity down. So people very rarely do this, but the clarity slider goes two ways for a reason. One way you can increase clarity. The other, we can decrease it. So we can lose detail intentionally. And if we look at this area of the sky up here, let me just temporarily disable. So that's without any clarity change. And that's with our clarity set to -100. So it's a significant change. It's got rid of all of the pattern in the sky. So all of that stuff around grayscale, We talked about clarity being a grayscale enhancer. Well, actually, it's also a grayscale detractor. So it can not only make everything that's grey decide whether it's going to be lighter or darker, in other words, give it more contrast. You can also get clarity if you tell it to go into the minus realm on this slider in here to give up its contrast. So you can say, actually, you as a pixel, I don't want you to decide whether you're darker or lighter. I want you just to go to mush. I want you to be no contrast, nice and smooth, and lose all the detail. What that's done is it's got rid of this effect in the sky that was a little bit distracting. And it also means I can afford to pull down our exposure a touch in the sky and pull up our saturation. So we knew that there was colour in the sky, but we've actually got a bit more that we can squeeze out of this. Don't use the saturation slider too much, makes the images look horrible, but there's enough in here that we can play with. Cool. Now, one final tweak. So we've got our background set with our levels. Looks quite nice. Our levels are helping us give some contrast in there. It's giving us a lovely curve here on the histogram. We've got nothing underexposed, nothing overexposed. That's what we're looking for in an image. And what we have got, though, is the opportunity here to make these mountains pop a little bit. So we saw up here we've removed clarity from the top of the sky. Well, what if we add a new layer, which is mountains, and we're going to add some clarity specifically to that area of the image. So that brush is probably a little bit big. I'm going to use a very, very rough brush. I'm going to go to 100%, and the reason is because I can always use this opacity slider here on my layer, or I can pull down clarity if I want to, if I've done it too much. So let's paint over our mountains along there. I don't really want to affect too much of the water. And actually, let's pick up this area here in the middle, this sort of island or spit or whatever it is. And that's going to let us enhance that a little bit on its own. So I'm now going to mask. I want to leave this alone. I don't want this to pop up too much. So I've got a mask that covers our mountains. And then if I wanted to be really picky about it, I could go in with the eraser tool, which is this one here next to the brush. And I can pull down our size there. And I can probably soften out the edges there, because I'm not worried about clarity necessarily hitting every edge of the mountains. It's the detail in the middle that I want to really pop. So just so we don't accidentally clip any of the sky and get any halos, we're just going to do that. Okay, cool. M, the button for mask, to turn that off. And then with that, we're going to use our clarity slider. I'm going to do an extreme. I'm going to go to 100%. So a bit too much. Let's pull it down to maybe, I don't know, about 30. That sort of works. I'm also going to use the structure slider in here. So if we look at this mountain here, we've got a little, well, in fact, we've got a lot of detail in there, to be fair. At this resolution, it's a little bit pixelated, but here we've got quite a bit of detail. We know this is masked. So let's pull our structure up a bit. Remember that structure is going to affect your edges more than the central areas. So clarity does clarity does areas. Think about it in those terms. Structure does the edges typically. So what we've got now is a little bit more of a pop on those bits. We could even afford with this particular layer. So at the moment, these are very, very slightly green actually. They're certainly very blue, but a little bit green. With this layer in isolation, we could pull our tint up a bit just to lose that green tint. And we could even warm it up a little bit there. I'm not affecting the sky, so remember I'm only affecting the bits that I painted on this layer. And all that's doing is it's just making this snow white rather than making it that slightly off-white colour before. So let's reset. There's our shot out of camera. So what we've done is we've done a crop. We've added in actually 3 layers. So we've got a layer that covers the mountains, makes them more clear with clarity. We've got a layer that darkens down the sky, but also removes some of the detail in the sky by using the reverse of clarity, so a negative clarity value. And we've got a layer on the bottom, which is another gradient, which pulls the focus up to the middle. And with that change, we get to there. That's quite a significant change. Now, part of that is the white balance issue. So white balance makes a big difference to the feel of an image. But overall, that crop makes a big difference. So we've lost a lot of this down here, which is, you know, it's interesting, but it's not the key point of the image. We've lost some of the area up here intentionally. There's nothing really there to look at. And we brought the viewer to look at this bit in the middle. Okay, so any questions on that one? I'm just going to wait for 10 seconds because we got that little delay. And then if not, we'll move on to the next one. Can't remember what the next one's going to be, but we'll have a look. Okay, so let's come out of full screen. By the way, to get to full screen, press F on your keyboard, you'll go to full screen. If you still want to access menu bars and stuff, if you move your mouse to the right, you'll see the library. If you move your mouse to the left, you'll see your tools. Sorry, not left, the library, it's the browser, sorry. Move your mouse to the right, you'll see the browser. Move your mouse to the left, you've got the tools. You've got access to all of the other tools as well. If you move your mouse to the top of the screen, you've got access to the top keyboard, top toolbar. So regardless of whether you're in full screen mode or not, you can still access all the tools. A lot of people prefer to edit in this mode, so there's no distractions. But press F again, or press the escape button, and you get back to the normal application pane. Okay. Next image, let's pull up this one. So this one from David, this is with a phase 1 150 megapixel back with a blue ring lens. F11 shouldn't be much in the way of diffraction, but let's just make sure. Yeah, it's pretty good. Let me just pull up into here. There's actually no purple fringing. Part of the reason, I'm just going to hit analyze, just like we should do, and let's get it correct for this particular lens. Part of the reason that we're not seeing much in terms of purple fringing or anything like that is it's actually quite a low contrast scene. We've got this big spike here in the histogram of exposure, and that's this big white area here, quite obviously. But the rest of the image is actually pretty evenly distributed, which tends to lead to quite a flat image. It's lacking in contrast. Up here, well, we've done it before. Let's see what's in there. We can pull our exposure down, and there we have a mountain range with some clouds and stuff up here. So there is detail in there, but it wasn't possible to get that detail at the same time as correctly exposing for the foreground, obviously. You can put a graduated filter on there, but with the dynamic range that you've got in this particular camera, you really probably don't need to, because what we can do is we can draw a little layer in, and we're going to call it sky. So before we even start playing with color or anything like that, we're going to get the exposure right. So let's pull our sky down here. So there's my mask for my sky. Now it's a bit difficult, this, because one of the parts that we want to darken down is this little cutout here, of course, which is the mountain area. Now the downside to that mountain area is it doesn't sit quite neatly in a straight line like a filter would do. So this has always been the problem with photographers using filters in a valley. If ever you're in a valley or a V-shape, something like Yosemite's tunnel view. In fact, maybe on the next session I'll load up a picture we've got of Yosemite so you can see the real problem. There's an extreme problem there. So on tunnel view, and in this is a slightly less of a problem, but it's still the same theory. You've got this V-shape. So you've got dark areas to the right and left, and you've got a bright area in the middle. If I use a standard graduated filter, obviously the ones that are made of glass, they've got a straight line across them. And whether it's a hard or a soft gradient, it's still a straight line. So if I bring the filter down low enough to bring this into its scope, well, now I'm darkening to the left and right as well. That's not very useful. If I bring the filter up, so it's not affecting these hills here, it's now also not affecting there, so that's no good to me either. This has always been the problem with filters. So some people are looking at V-shaped filters at the moment, that's fine, but then you have the issue of, well, hold on a minute, my V-shape image isn't quite the same V-shape that the filter is designed for. So instead, what we can do is we can use our Luma range. So here we've got our sky, we've got our gradient, we can see that in red, and it falls off quite slowly. I'm going to click this Luma range box. In fact, before I do that, let's get rid of the browser so we can focus on this. I'm going to zoom in slightly, just so that we can see this a bit better. That's cool. So with my Luma range selected, now remember the Luma range is deciding, or is choosing which bits of the mask to apply based on how bright they are, which bits of the image to apply the mask to based on how bright it is. So we know that we want to attack everything that's bright white, fine, but we don't want to attack the stuff that's down here in these darker midtones. So I've got this slider here, and as I pull it, you'll see the mask change. on the picture. There we go, it's creeping up the hillside. Creeping up a bit more, and about there we get clear of all the trees. Cool. Okay, so we're clear of all the trees now, but there's a problem. Remember, we've got that hard line, and the hard line around here is the hard line around those trees and the edge. We've got two ways, and in fact, if you remember last session on Monday, David Grover pointed out there are two ways actually to do this. One way, which I typically use, is the fall off. So with this fall off slider, this is a hard line here, and it's saying, right, everything from this line in terms of its range, so at 192 on the histogram, everything that's not 192 is no mask, and everything that's higher than 192 mask completely. If I put this ramp in place, this fall off, so watch what's happening to the mask. So you see this hard line here around the trees. In fact, let me go a little bit closer in so we can see it. So now I know the value, and 150 megapixel image, you can see the trees miles away on an 80mm lens. So let's pull up our Luma range again. I knew that that value was 192 because that's what we just did. There we go. So with no fall off, we get this hard line around the trees, and that's going to be horrible because if I apply that mask and I pull on our exposure, we're going to get this horrible line here. And it's some people will call it haloing, I call it a mess. So let's not do that. Let's fix it correctly in the mask first. So let's display the mask. And there are two methods, as we said. One is I fall off smoothly. So you can see the red area, as I pull this down, it starts to creep down the tree line a little bit. I don't really want to affect the trees, remember? So I need to pull this so that it's smooth enough that I don't get that halo effect, but not so smooth that it starts creeping down the tree line. That looks about right. So now if I were to pull our exposure down, we get much less of a halo. There's still a bit of a halo there. Okay, so then we've got another tool, which is we can use our radius on the mask. And the radius is going to soften all those edges even more. And the best way of seeing that is if I do Shift and M, sorry, I'm talking about Option and M. So that changes our mask from being red to being grayscale. So let's zoom into here. So we're going into the real pixel level stuff here. With that radius, if I turn the radius back down to 0, you see how sharp these lines are. So even with that fall off, the lines are really sharp. So you're going to see a halo when we do it. If I pull the radius up, it's softening that transition between the area that's masked and the area that isn't masked. Now this is all down to, you're just going to have to play with this slider to get the right amount. But what that delivers, if I turn our mask off and I pull our exposure down again to what we were doing before, we get no halo. There's no line. So that's how you do it on tree lines without getting a halo effect. It used to be a little while ago, not too long ago, that you would have to draw a mask and you'd have the ability when you were drawing of doing some auto mask stuff. And it would be very, very clever. We could do this auto mask in here. And as we were masking, it would use these three lines together. In fact, you get an extra little line there. And it would take the center circle here and say that's definitely masked. And the outer circle would be the edge of my pen, and the bit that's in the middle, that's the sort of ring in the middle, that would be the area that it was trying to be intelligent with, and as I draw it across, it would try and get it right around the trees. It was pretty good, but you'd still have to feather the mask afterwards. With the Luma range, you don't, because it's handling all that feathering through either radius or fall off in here. So if ever you've got a tree line that you're trying to fix with an exposure difference, use that Luma range, but use the fall off and use the radius together. You get a nice soft transition. So what that's done is it's given us a mask. So if I turn that off and turn that on again, look at that difference out there. So we go from this here to that which was there originally. And if we look at our histogram up here, by doing that, it shifted these bright areas down by roughly 1 stop. Well, that makes sense because we pulled the exposure down by 1 stop. But also in that top area, we can now pull up some clarity. So we can make that mountain, remember, that's the bit that's most interesting. So let's pull that down to 0. If I put it up to 100, it now stands out a lot more. Let's just make sure we haven't done too much damage by doing that. No, not bad. I wouldn't use it at 100 normally, so we'll just out of consistency, let's put it down to sort of 50 or 60 or something like that. Okay, so that's got our detail back out here in the mountain. I want some more contrast in this area overall, however. So let's draw another gradient. So I'm going to call this one contrast. Oops, contrast with a T even, that might even be better. Okay, so here's our area, and I'm going to pull down from here all the way down to there. So there's our mask. And in fact, I'm going to make it even lower down there. Okay, so I'm affecting everything up here, not affecting anything down here. I'll press the M button to get rid of the mask again. And let's use this area to try some experiments. So we'll put up contrast first. So who can tell me what the problem with using the contrast slider is? I'm just going to sit and do this for 2 seconds. So that's with contrast added, and that's with contrast taken away. So why aren't we getting more definition in these hills by adding contrast? Surely that doesn't make sense. If anyone knows, otherwise I'm going to ruin the surprise by telling you the reason. Oh, silence. The thing is, I don't know if it's the delay, the 10 or 15 second delay, or whether people are just stumped. We'll work it out. Okay, so here's the issue with contrast. The contrast tool is designed to separate, and effectively, if you imagine it like it's squeezing out from the middle, so it's pushing stuff that's on the top 50% further bright and stuff that's on the bottom 50% further dark. So imagine you're sort of putting an elephant in the middle of the histogram. Oops, I just moved the histogram in the wrong place. Elephant in the middle of the histogram, and it pushes that stuff to the right and pushes that stuff to the left. Okay, here's the problem with these hills. These hills are not on the left, so they're not going to get darker. They're sat right here, in this area here, just to the right of the middle. So if I pull the contrast up, it's just going to make them brighter, which is the opposite of what we wanted to. We wanted to see them better. We wanted to see them darker. So by using the contrast tool, it's doing the opposite to what we think. And the reason is because this area here isn't already dark. The contrast tool will make dark areas darker, but it will also make the areas in the top 50% of the image brighter. So just be careful with using the contrast tool for that reason. We could use the levels tool. So on our levels, we know that this one here is our midtone slider. So if I were to pull this that way, it's going to make all the midtones brighter. If I pull it the other way, it makes the midtones darker. That's kind of useful. That's done quite a bit of a trick for us. That's quite nice. Yeah, not bad actually. Now remember, this is only applying to this layer, so it's not going to have any effect down here. So the advantage of doing the levels on this layer rather than the whole image, if I'd done that little levels trick on the whole image, we'd be making this area down here darker as well. We don't want that. So we only want to apply it to the area that's up here and masked. So that's pretty good. By pulling our levels up, we've got a lot more contrast up there. That's great. We can now also use clarity. So we can pull our clarity up a bit. That's going to make it pop a bit more. Cool. And then we can use our high dynamic range, but not in the way that we've been using it to date. So to date, we've used high dynamic range to recover highlights. In other words, make the highlights darker. To recover shadows, to recover whites, so make the very brightest parts of the image darker as well. And we've used it to recover shadows and black. So in other words, pull the stuff that's off the left-hand side of the histogram into the middle, so recover all that shadow detail that you wouldn't normally see. Well, we can also use high dynamic range. Now in version 20, this was introduced, you can make highlights brighter, and you can make the whites brighter, but you can also make the shadows darker and the black areas darker. So rather than always trying to recover in Capture 120, you can actually use it to a different effect. And in this case, I want to take any shadows that we do have out here, and I want to make them darker. So let's pull that down, and look at that difference. So you'll find it especially out here. Let's just go into these trees. So by pulling the shadows down, we get all this definition back in here. And I don't have to use clarity over the top to get it, because clarity is going to also give us this haloing around here, which I don't particularly want. So we use a touch of clarity, not too much, and we use our shadow slider, but instead of pulling the shadows up to recover detail, we pull our shadows all the way down to darken the stuff that was already in the shadows to begin with. That's having a bit of an effect on this tree here, because we don't want to make that darker than it already was. So here's the fun tool. We've already been through it today, Luma range. So let's display the mask, and I can discount stuff that's already way, way dark. So by pulling that up there, this tree is now excluded from that gradient mask. That's pretty neat. That saves a heck of a lot of drawing masks. Now I'm going to use that fall off to soften it, and I'm going to use that radius just like we did before to really smooth out the transition. So if I now go to apply and turn off our mask, so now we haven't affected this tree. So with that contrast, a little bit. So let's just fix our Luma range a little bit more. Let's go about, oops, maybe up to about there. Yeah, we need a bit of fall off. Okay, apply that. Cool. So we've now got a load of detail back in here that we didn't have before. If I go and pull up our browser, let's create a clone of this variant and reset. So what we've got now, you can see all this detail out here. This was before, this is after. So there's a few steps that we've gone through. We've lowered down the sky. We've also increased our clarity down here. We've used some Luma mask stuff in there to only affect the mountain. Used some shadow recovery, but in the opposite way. So actually making our shadows darker out here. Just to pull back the detail. So it's about 3 or 4 steps, but it means that we've gone from this, which is a bit washed out, and certainly out here in the mountains, you're losing lots of detail, to here, we've got all that detail back, which is much better. Then we go on to our crop. Let's just hide our browser. And up here, obviously, we've got a lot of stuff up here that's actually not necessary to this shot. We've got this random rooster down here that's sort of running around the farm. And we've got this little bit here that's a bit annoying. It's part of a roof. We can heal that out. So let's just do a new heal layer. And with our brush, we're going to make sure it's set to 100. And I'm going to increase the brush size. I'm going to take a couple of the trees from here, paint them over here, let go. Oh, it's not having a great effect. Part of that may be because my heal layer is on top of all of these other layers. No, if not, not perfect. Let's go a clone layer instead. Let's give that a go. So again, same principle. We draw our vector and we say repeat. That's a bit weird. Not exactly sure why we're getting that effect because we haven't got any mask or anything on it. So for the purposes of speediness, instead of trying to do that, we're just going to crop that out. It's a lot easier. If we were playing with this a bit more, what I might do is put an update in later on as to why that was behaving like that. If we were playing with it a bit more, we'd probably just spend some time and heal it out. Failing that though, let's just pull down our crop. So this at the moment is a 4:3 crop, traditional medium format aspect ratio. That's all great, but it means that we've got a lot of stuff up here that we don't necessarily need. So let's pull this down to a 3:2 aspect ratio. Remember, I wanted to lose this part of the roof here, so let's pull that just in there to that edge. Still got our rooster down here in the corner. Let's pull this down into there. That looks pretty good. And then the one final thing I'd be tempted to do is to add a bit more color up into the top. Yeah. So Davis just said, glad to see others have fun with the heal tool. The heal tool, I find to be one of the most temperamental tools in Capture One. Sometimes when you're brushing, the preview of what you're brushing is a little bit off. I've had issues where what it heals is a little bit wacky, to say the least, but I have had instances where it's done something that's absolute genius. So it can be a little bit temperamental. Stick with it, but it is one of these things where, and we talk about this before. One person was talking on YouTube. We had a comment stream going on for quite some time about Photoshop versus Capture One. Capture One is not designed to do everything. It is designed to get you a completely correctly developed picture. If you start wanting to play with pixel level changes, or, for example, if I wanted to start changing some of the detail around this rooster down here, or changing some of the stuff here, or removing flip-flops and stuff like that, yes, you can do it in Capture One. The healing tool is very, very good. But if you really want to get into pixel level detail, then other tools, things like Photoshop, can help you there. So then one final thing with this shot, I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to call it saturation, and you'll see why. On this layer I'm going to create a gradient, and I want to bring up the level of saturation in the background without bringing up the level of saturation in the foreground. So just about there, maybe a bit too much there. I don't want this to be more saturated, but this was out in the haze a little bit, so not only did it lose a bit of contrast, it also lost a little bit of color. So just by putting on this mask and saying for this area here and then slowly lose it, just put in another 15 on saturation slider, just gets you a lot more detail. So again, let's go before and after, a huge amount more detail. On the after shot, we could even now go into a new filled layer and use our levels tool to really make it pop. So let's go full screen. So there's our before shot, and that's with our changes. Mountains back, got a lot more detail. So all of this stuff out here that was washed out, we've now got all this detail in here out in the Himalayas, and all this detail on the terraces. Cool. So, hope all of that stuff made sense to everyone. Those are the three that we'll do today. If anyone else wants to send in pictures, then please do send them to that, or go to that tool, go to that in your web browser. So paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. You send in the raw file, remember not JPEGs, only the raw files, and we will try and get them into a session and edit them live on the screen. Again, for those of you that want to go and buy Capture One, then there are the offers, 25% off the Pro version, 30% off upgrades, or if you want to go and try and get a free one, go to that address by the 15th, and hopefully you can be in with a chance of winning one of the Pro licenses. Next session we do is going to be on Monday, next Monday, the 13th at 3 o'clock UK time. So that's, what is that, 10 o'clock New York, about 11 o'clock in Hong Kong-ish, and really sorry to the people in Australia and New Zealand, that's about the middle of the night, but we'll do some earlier ones later on. Cool, that's it from me, and failing that, or failing anything else, we'll catch you next time. Cheers, bye.